Today, we continue with our exploration of Jews in art with one of the most famous Jews. What can I say? When I teach about Judaism at Vassar College, I could get, 10, 15 people in a classroom. But when I teach about Jesus, I could get 50 people in the classroom because everybody's fascinated by Jesus. Actually, I had to put this presentation together really quickly because I thought that Ari had asked me to speak about Jewish cheeses in art. And I had started thinking about brinza, which is a characteristic Romanian cheese, right, Mom? Brinza, right? You have it with Mama Liga, correct, right? It's hard to get here. I wouldn't say it's a Jewish cheese, but Jews ate it. But no, it's not about cheeses, it's about Jesus. And as you can see in this beautiful first slide, one of Ari Katz's most brilliant moves in the history of CSP was to recreate the so-called Last Supper after Adi Ness, who you see above with Israeli soldiers, and after Leonardo da Vinci, who you see at the very top. This is a very interesting
But I just want to
topic.
make sure that people understand that was a camping trip for CSP, and that was our
And
last supper. And
ah,
our friend, that's Nathan Taft. So if you know Noah and Dahlia, he came with a beard, and I was like, "Wow, you look like Jesus." And then I saw him sitting there, and I said, "Hey, man, I think we can recreate something at the camping table." So that's how we got there.
brilliant. As always, Ari is what we British people like to call innovative, very innovative. Um, and this is a topic that is not covered actually in my forthcoming book. I deal with a lot of other things, but the book after this book, God willing, which is called Jewish Spaces in Christian Art, I'm just working on that, will actually deal with the Jewish Jesus to some extent. And just to let you know where we are, if you haven't been following along or you need a refresher, we started with the earliest images of Jews in art, Jews as an object of fascination. Then we talked about good Jews, priests, prophets, and monarchs as exemplifications of essentially Christian virtues in art, sometimes Muslim virtues. Then we talked about demonization, the roots of the idea that the Jews are the roots of all evil. On December 19th, we'll be coming back and talking about the, so to speak, the flowers of that idea, anti-Semitism in modernity and postmodernity. And today we're kind of right in the middle, and we're talking about the Jewish Jesus in art. I've told the story before, but not maybe not all of you have heard it. That um, uh, you know, Jesus appears in Jewish art in a painting which happens to be the very favorite painting of an important world figure, and that is this painting, the White Crucifixion, painting by Marc Chagall, depicting the crucifixion of Jesus, painted in 1938 after Chagall had visited Europe from Russia, right? And you can see it at the Art Institute of Chicago. You have the reds and the whites and the Ma'apilim, the refugees, the quote unquote illegal immigrants, right, trying to get into Palestine, and burning synagogues, and the patriarchs and matriarchs on high, and candlesticks, and the wandering Jew, and just about every Torah scrolls, right? Just about every Jewish symbol possible. And in the midst of it, we have recognizable Jesus, who is his loincloth is a talit. And above his head, it has the titulus, the inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Hebrew. And it also happens to be this fellow's favorite painting. And as some of you know, I happen to know that because I visited that fellow, Pope Francis I, because it was his favorite painting, and a friend of his had seen it in my book and recommended my other book to him. So I ended up meeting him. But it's truly a fascinating painting, and sort of creates a coincidence of a lot of interesting themes in art and Judaism. So it emphasizes and how would you say, correlates the suffering of Jesus and the Jewish people, right? Violent acts occur, right? And Jesus is wearing a prayer shawl, as I say. And, though many of Chagall's paintings are lively, romantic, humorous, imaginative, filled with brilliant colors, this one's largely drained of color. And he painted it in response to the events of Kristallnacht, and the other world events that were going on. But we're not here to talk about Jesus in art made by Jews, but Jesus as a Jew in art made for others and by others. Um, in order to talk about I do have to talk about the wide varieties of the depictions of Jesus in art made for Christians, from some of the earliest depictions of the 4th century, in which in these sort of literally iconic, because they're icons, right? Icones, visions from Byzantine and Greek Christianity carried over to Russian Christianity, very different from the West, as we'll see. You have Jesus, who's depicted as this sort of massive blessing figure, right? The Pantocrat, or the creator of all, is Jesus is associated with the Father God holding the gospel in his hand, and giving the blessing, the Trinitarian blessing, 1, 2, 3, Father, Son, Spirit. And if you look at him closely, you'll see that his eyes are of different sizes. And and his face is asymmetrical. And this is designed to disorient the viewer, right? And to give you this sense of this person who's human but not quite human, or maybe meta-human. When this is copied in Russian icons, the same it's not corrected. The same discrepancy is left. We do have images called the Holy Face of Jesus. And if we're talking about images of Jesus in art, Jewish or not, it's important to note that the first instantiation of Jesus's face being reproduced in an artwork was in what's called an acheiroptic artwork, an artwork created without hands. The legend is that there was a woman named Veronica who mopped Jesus's brow with her sudarium, with her tichel, while he was carrying his headcloth, while he was carrying his cross, and his face was miraculously imprinted on that tichel, on that sudarium, on that headcloth. And that image, which is described by early Byzantine writers as being symmetrical, with the locks of the hair and the locks of the beard, and the little forelock of the hair, and how the eyes look, very detailed description, is repeated throughout the history of art. Now, it's interesting. The story is interesting because, of course, Veronica can possibly have been called Veronica if this story has any semblance of truth. I don't mean that Jesus's image was truly imprinted on this piece of cloth, but if some woman came forward and mopped his brow while he was on the way to the crucifixion, Veronica, of course, her name is Vera Icona, true image. So it's clearly a name. Her name wasn't remembered, but they created a name for her that reflected her actions. And you can see this image repeating itself, right? Even in later Netherlandish art, and in early modern Dutch art, the artist Albrecht Dürer takes it on and creates a self-portrait in the style of the Vera Icon, which is very cool and worth talking about in art history class, but I'm just showing it to you now. There's a lot to say about this image. And then other lesser artists take up that image and project it back onto Jesus. So instead of having an Albrecht Dürer who looks like Jesus, you have a Jesus who looks like Albrecht Dürer, which is very disorienting. In fact, this was a very important image in the history of German art, right? Here you have Dürer's self-portrait adored by the personification of art, right? Once Protestantism comes in, Jesus develops a sort of, there's a sort of less exaltedly Byzantine otherworldliness to him, and much more of a human nature, but also a lot of more kitsch, even, if you could imagine, comes into the images. So these are famous images by a early 20th century artist called Seligman, who was not Jewish. There was a legend that he was Jewish, and then he converted to Christianity when he saw the image of Jesus. This was just not true. Protestant guy, but this is the image that if you grew up Protestant, and some of you may have, or may still be, you saw in all your Sunday school classrooms, right? A lot has been made of this image, and it's been put into different contexts. Tremendously kitschy, right? Remixed, right? So that it becomes a black Jesus in some case, a buff sort of pedophilic Jesus in another case. This is awfully egregiously kitschy, right? Or in this case, similarly, you know, the buff young man guided by the buff Jesus. appearing in the foliage here, that same image. And it was such a popular image throughout Protestant Christianity that it was in fact widely parodied. So here's Jesus delivering pizza. In modernity and postmodernity, of course, artists like Dali have taken up the image of Jesus. And artists have tweaked the classical images of Jesus, such as Michelangelo's Pietà, which my mother reminds me, was it my mother who reminded me? I think yes, that this sculpture was brought to the 1964 World's Fair, right? And I was at the 1964 World's Fair in utero, in my mother's womb. So I didn't see this out of the womb till I was about 50 years old. But a variety of artists have taken up that image and reinterpreted it, right? Likewise, Leonardo's famous Last Supper, as uh, interpreted by contemporary artists. Now, that's a very brief history of variety, just to give you a sense of the variety, the many, many different ways Jesus appears in art. What's interesting theologically about Jesus is that since Jesus is human and divine, the human part gives artists an opportunity to exploit the idea that human beings are so incredibly diverse. And so Jesus can have incredibly diverse meanings and valences for everybody who looks at it. The other thing that comes up when we think about art and Jesus and the Jews is the fact that a great deal of art made in the Middle Ages that dealt with Jewish themes was kind of manifestly anti-Semitic. And even when Jesus is sort of injected into those let's say anti-Jewish, because anti-Semitism is a later phenomenon, anti-Jewish, right? When Jesus is interjected into those anti-Jewish scenes, it becomes a little strange, right? So this is a very famous image of Jesus brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and you can see that the Jews in the image, the high priest and his henchmen, they're all animalistic faces, dark skin, etc. And Jesus, who is the Jew, right? Who is a Jew, is depicted as a sort of white-skinned Aryan figure, right? Or in this trigger warning, horrific image of the abuse and murder, the ritual abuse and murder of Simon of Trent, which was a fiction promulgated against the Jews of Trent when a young child was found murdered. His body had been thrown into the Jewish ghetto. He had been abused. And so the Jews were accused of this. But you can see that this fanciful image, which shows the Jews circumcising Simon and then preparing to kill him, depicts him as if on a cross. So this is the Christian boy as the Jewish boy who's being tortured by the Jews. Very complicated. In general, the idea of circumcision as something violent, we have baby Jesus being set upon by these voracious, criminal-looking Jews with their sharp knives. Can't look at it too much. And then, of course, every Jesus movie you've seen in which Jesus is, depicted as this long-suffering guy, and the Jews are these evil, animalistically faced, legalists. So, it's not a very, very pretty picture. If we want to look for Jesus in medieval art, we find not only Jesus per se, but echoes, as I say, of Jesus, right? And those echoes continue through modernity. If we want to look at Jesus in medieval art made for Jews, we have to say, Jesus who? Where's the beef? I mean, there's very little evidence of that. In fact, there's a kind of mitigation against the image of Jesus in Jewish context, where we have scenes that look vaguely like scenes from Christian art, such as this flight into Egypt, but it's not Jesus's flight into Egypt, Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus. It's Moses in a Haggadah fleeing Midian for the land of Egypt and returning to the land of Egypt. And of course, that there's a difference because there's two babies there, there's a dog, there's another figure, right? So it sort of plays off of, it riffs, R-I-F-F-S, off the classical images of Jesus, right? In the flight into Egypt, but it adopts and adapts it and changes it from the singular baby to the two babies and other alterations, right? Um, in um, in Jewish art, you would be surprised to find that there's occasionally just a hint of the crucifixion. What do I mean by that? You will find images of the hanging of Haman in Christian art, because it says that Vayitlu et Haman al ha'etz asher hichim leMordechai v'chamat hamelech shochacha, and they hanged Haman upon the tree that he had prepared for Mordechai. In the book of Esther, Haman is this genocidal character who wants to destroy all the Jews, but he gets his exact comeuppance, and he had prepared a gallows for Mordechai, or he had prepared to impale Mordechai or to crucify him. This idea of talui al eitz either means hanging, impaling, or crucifixion in the Roman sense. And so occasionally in Christian art, Haman is shown crucified, which is kind of interesting. Similarly, in the Sistine Chapel, Haman is crucified in a very dramatic way. He's coming toward us, right? It's a very dramatic image in this lunette from the Sistine Chapel. If you guys want to go to Italy, I'm open for it. You know, Ari wants to go explore other places like outer space, you know, but if you want to do a trip for Italy, you have to tell him, because I'll take you to the Vatican. I'll give you a private tour. We'll meet the Pope. The Pope will take us to the Sistine Chapel and show us all this stuff, right? But if you're not interested, it's fine. It's fine. So here he is, Haman, crucified again, right? Different from Jesus in that we see his genitals, right? Different from Jesus in that he comes toward us, right? Nonetheless, a hint at the crucifixion. Or, as I pointed out earlier, we have this idea of the tree of Jesse, right? The Jewish ancestors of Jesus who are, so to speak, suspended on a tree. And it's no wonder then that when Jews come to depict the image of Haman being hanged, Haman being hung would be a different meaning, which we won't get into. But Haman being hanged, grammatically correct, right? It's shown as a sort of, he's being hanged by the neck, but it's sort of analogous to this tree of Jesse, in the sense that at the foot of the tree we have Haman's daughter. She has poured a chamber pot over the head of the man she thinks is her father, but is in fact, she thinks is Mordechai, but is in fact her father, and she commits suicide at the base of the tree. And so there's a relationship between the tree of Jesus's Jewish ancestors in Christian art and the tree of the hanged Haman and his sons in Jewish art. Right. That sequence works something like this. In fact, the idea of weeping for the death of Jesus is taken up and exploited in Jewish art as well. This is a brilliant image from the Golden Haggadah of the death of the firstborn. And we see in this image a little baby lying pietà-like in the lap of its mother. So clearly the people who created the Golden Haggadah had seen pietas. When I say the artist that the Jews commissioned. So this is a Jewish manuscript depicting an Egyptian woman mourning for a child who has died in the plague of the firstborn. And I argue that the artists were playing on the trope, on the image of the pietà, but of pietas, I would say. Pietà just means the person who has mercy, because there is the pietà, which is too late for this image. This image was made around 1320, and Michelangelo doesn't get to create his famous pietà in stone until the late 1500s, 1498 or 1500. But there were many images from the appropriate time period which showed Mary mourning for Jesus. Interestingly, in the same manuscript, we have the Egyptians mourning for their cattle when the animals are killed, and in that sense, they resemble a scene of the holy personages mourning around at the foot of the cross. So much so that this figure here looks remarkably like Saint John from the crucifixion. So again, playing on these ideas, right? Right. Oh, one more. Right. Oops, sorry. So we alluded at the beginning with Ari's brilliant help to the idea of the Last Supper. And the Last Supper is not just a dinner table, because your dinner table you would probably see more in three dimensions, more as a square with people around it. Here in Leonardo's Last Supper, everyone is famously posed facing front, so that everybody's characteristic gestures and everybody's movements, and Jesus himself is this triangle in the middle, right, with his hands blessing the bread, and this monumental figure, it's all comes together in a sort of monumental, almost theological way. And as I say, while we don't see Jesus much in medieval Jewish art, we do have references to these Christian images, right? So here in the first Darmstadt Haggadah, we have a Seder table, and at the center of the Seder table, there are figures talking and debating, women along with men. So we might have the image of a female Jesus here, or at least it's hard to tell the genders of everybody. Clearly, the figure on the left with the book is a woman, the figure on the right with the book is a woman. This is a man, 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 but these figures 1, 2, and 3 may in fact be female figures, right? So it's just interesting that we have a female Jewish figure in place of Jesus, which in a way is evocative of some of the rebootings that or maybe perhaps rebootyings that I showed you before. This Renee Cox, Your Mama's Last Supper, and similarly Renee Cox's Pietà, right? So the idea of the shocking, so to speak, idea of a female Jesus continues to append and apply. So likewise, so that's the first Darmstadt Haggadah. Likewise, in our old favorite, the bird's head or griffin's head Haggadah, we see a Seder table, which is again configured in the way a Last Supper would be, full frontal, right? And what's interesting about this Seder table is that what you're seeing here is the Messianic Seder. You're seeing the Seder at the end of time. There are men and women sitting together, which you don't see in all the other illustrations, and you have the actual Paschal sacrifice, this roast ram that's brought into the table. So it's like a reclamation, right? There was the Passover. Christians took that on as the Last Supper, and then using the morphological configuration, the same shape, so to speak, Jews reappropriated the Last Supper idea in art that they commissioned. Of course, throughout the Middle Ages, we have a tradition of clashing symbols. And I don't mean symbols, CYMBALS, right? Ch-chung, silsile shama, but clashing symbols, or symbols that are reappropriated and rebooted. So, for instance, the unicorn hunt is a motif in Jewish art, but it had been a motif classically in Christian art intended to represent the passion of Jesus, right? How Jesus is hunted down and tortured, as you can see here, by Christians used to say before Vatican II, by the Jews, right? Now we would say by the Romans, right? Or when the unicorn in the unicorn hunt is brought to the noble family, the Lord and his lady. It's draped over a horse, its body deposed in a way that recalls the famous pictures of the deposition, Jesus being taken down from the cross. So when we see an image of a unicorn hunt in Jewish art, we have to think to ourselves, how is this rebooted? How is this pulled back from the way it is used as a Jesus reference to passion, crucifixion, and deposition in Christian art. It's highly improbable that such an image would have been appropriated wholesale and wholeheartedly without some sort of shift in the thinking of the Jewish patrons, right, regarding the meaning of the unicorn, and therefore regarding attempting to make a move away from Jesus. So essentially, the history in the Middle Ages of depictions of the Jewish Jesus in art are few and far between. Um, there are occasional images of Jesus appearing wearing that characteristic pointed Jewish hat. I didn't put it in, but I'll get Ari some for the follow-up. And that is interesting because Jesus appears in the pointed Jewish hat after the resurrection. Why is that? It's because it says that when the disciples were eating a meal at Emmaus, Jesus appeared to them in the guise of just a normal person, you see? And so the normal person here is the Jew. And so you have Jesus in the Jewish hat with a halo, which is very, very precious. But most of this is pre-modern, and I would urge us to move on and to think about modernity and postmodernity. There was an exhibition in the Tel Aviv Museum, and it was quite a great exhibition about the Jewish Jesus in art, primarily about Jewish art or art made by Jews, but also some other examples. I'd like to talk about some of those, primarily Jewish artists, because the interest in the Jewish Jesus was mostly taken up by Jewish artists attempting to reclaim Jesus in some way. This is an object of, or it's a topic of fascination for many Jewish thinkers. You might think in some sense that it's an attempt to sort of get in good with Christians and Christianity. I don't think that that's all that's going on there. I think it's an attempt to think again about history and to understand again that this character Jesus, who we've talked about in a couple of series here, is at core and at base a Jew, and we have to try to reconcile what people said about him with what he said about himself, and how what he said about himself and about the world is filtered through a Christian lens. Right. So my most popular course at Vassar, as I've said, is what I'm teaching next semester. It's called Jesus, a Radical Life. And I have about 48 people signed up for it now. That's much too much for a small liberal arts environment in which students are paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars to attend, right? They should get more personal attention. But I leave the enrollment at 48 because I know that after the first class, everybody will drop out except 15 students. And that's because they will figure out, because I will tell them in no uncertain terms, that they will not learn about Christianity in this class. It's really a class about Judaism. And there's nothing as unpopular to teach about, believe me, than Judaism, right? So all the people who came because they thought they were going to learn something about Christianity will drop out, and we'll have a nice, small, comfortable group. And I begin that class with these words. I say, Jesus was a Zionist. He was also fervently opposed to the occupation, by which I mean the brutal Roman occupation of what Jesus knew as Eretz Israel, and what the Romans called Palestine. Then I talk about the origins of the term Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. And that throws a lot of students for a loop. They realize they don't want to be in a class that's, that questions the eternity of the Palestine concept as somehow belonging to Palestinian Arabs, or questions, or positions Jesus as a quote unquote Zionist, whatever that meant in the first century, right? Or indeed doesn't talk about Christianity. So what I like about art in modernity that deals with the Jewish Jesus is that it raises a lot of these questions. First of all, Europe. Mark Antikolsky was an important Russian sculptor and artist. He was one of these hyper-realist, classicizing sculptors. His work is not particularly interesting in terms of being innovative or anything essentially more than pretty kitschy. But it's interesting that he chose to depict Jesus in a full-size, three-dimensional work of art. This is something that you have to realize is, in 1876, as it was in 1500, as it might be in 2024, an almost heretical move, right? Because it's a graven image, and it's a graven image of somebody who other people regard as their God, right? So it's very, very interdicted in Jewish history. On the other hand, it's a way that um, sacralization of the image is mitigated. And he says, I want to show him as a reformer who rebelled against the injustice perpetrated by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He lived and died as a Jew for the truth and brotherhood. This is the reason why I like to create in him a pure Jewish type and represent him with a covered head. That was a big deal to show Jesus in a yarmulke, right? It also, just for your information, we're on the cusp in another 30 years of the Russian Revolution, when injustice and rebellion will be on the menu. And it's also right in the midst of a historicizing tendency where a lot of artists and sculptors, painters are attempting to recapture the historical context of the images that they're creating. They don't want to create Jesus as let's say, a pale European, right? But they want to, even though this guy is very pale here, they want him to be a pure Jewish type. And this was the era of types, the pure Negro type, the pure Jewish type, the pure Oriental type, right? These are stereotypes carved in stone. And one of them, among all the other sort of ethnographic surveys, was the Jewish one. Of course, the suffering Jesus, looking out at you, inviting you to contemplate his wounds, was a very important and central motif in what was called the devotio moderna of the Middle Ages, the new devotion, the modern devotional context, where instead of just being actors performing a drama, the sacred figures in Christian art reached out to the viewer and said, look at me, contemplate me, feel my pain, see my wounds, experience them, right? And so painting became much more bloody, much more realistic, much more directed at the viewer. And that gaze of Jesus gazing out, called the Man of Sorrows, right, is echoed by E.M. Lillian, who is a very important Jewish graphic artist at the turn of the 20th century. And here you have the Jew wearing a striped kaftan, which sort of foreshadows, in fact, the concentration camp garb, but this is from 1900, right? With thorns and briars sort of growing out of him, and he is looking past the colossi of Memnon and the pyramids over a wide, deep gap toward the sunshine of Zion, right? And he is doing essentially what he is in the place of Jesus. He's doing what Jesus calls upon us to do in these early modern paintings, which is, as Lamentation says, look upon me and see, is there any pain like my pain, right? And this continues with his monument in graphics to the martyrs of Kishinev, the great Kishinev pogrom in 1902. And here you have a Jew who's bound at the stake wearing a tallis. This is obviously where Chagall gets some of his stuff from, right? And an angel with the Torah scroll is kissing him on the forehead as the Torah scroll rises from the flames, goes up to heaven, right? So the idea of Jesus, Jewish martyrial suffering in parallel to Jesus, is not something that occurs only with Chagall. But of course, it does occur with Chagall, who was obsessed with the motif. So you have Jesus in tefillin shoyad, in tefillin shorosh. You have the Jewish kalmuk, the Jewish sort of peasant, crucified, right, by the others in his society, and many crucifixions along the road. And then, of course, you have finally the white crucifixion. So the European trajectory is to emphasize the suffering of Jesus, the victimhood of Jesus, the parallel suffering and victimhood of Jews who are like Jesus or perhaps even exceed Jesus in their martyrdom. In Israel, it's a little bit different, right? There is some of that. Reuben has the artist displaying his wounds, his calloused hands from holding so many paintbrushes, right? It's kind of funny, in the way that Montaigne's Christ as the suffering Redeemer displays his hand wounds, right? The long suffering. So there is that. And of course, there is the idea of suffering here, the temptation in the desert, reconfigured as a bunch of refugees who are making their way through the desert and suffering, right? And you can see the parallels here with Titian's Noli Me Tangere, which is Jesus's appearance to the Magdalene, to Mary Magdalene after his death, and she wants to touch him. He says, "Don't touch me," right? Because he's divine. So here you have an image of a woman sort of reaching out to this tortured figure, right? And also reference to Bellini's Agony in the Garden. So the Israeli art at the beginning is quite derivative. But then it becomes kind of more sort of self-generating. And here you have this encounter, the old Jew and the suffering Jesus sitting on a bench overlooking Haifa, right? And the sort of parallels between their suffering. And of course, this also evokes Lillian, who was the most famous predecessor in his may our eyes behold the return, your return, God, to Zion with mercy. The angel is tapping the shoulder of the self-absorbed, suffering-absorbed Jew who can't get out of his own suffering, enwrapped again in thorns, and pointing toward Tevye the Milchiger, who now is plowing walking toward the son of Zion, right? The son, S-U-N, of Zion, right? Reiterations of the Madonna and Child, right? And of course, the first Seder in Jerusalem of Reuben, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multi-religious observance context, beautiful painting actually, is also the Last Supper because the guest at the Seder is not Elijah the prophet, but Reuben himself here. And on the other side, of course, is Jesus. Israelis really like crucifixions themselves, right? For reasons of feeling that the Israelis are picking up the cross, so to speak, of Europe and bearing it into the Middle East and sometimes being crucified on it, but also sometimes triumphing over death, right? Uri Tzvi Greenberg, in the famous poem, "Go to Galilee, wrap your body well. Do not say he hangs there dead on a tree. He hangs in the center of the world and looks out to the last generation. At the end of the world, he longs to return to the land of Israel, and he will return to the land of Israel in the prayer shawl that was on his shoulders when he went to be crucified," right? So, obvious reference to this work of art. Moshe Kastel, pretty straightforward crucifixion. Jewish-looking Jesus, Hebrew inscription. Moshe Hoffman, right? 6,000,001, right? Somebody is being taken off the cross by a German soldier. And then Tumarkin's Bedouin crucifixion, which he comments on the displacement of the Bedouin in terms of Matthias Grunwald's famous Isenheim altarpiece, also echoing a lot of Tumarkin's work, the Isenheim altarpiece, right? And then more abstract, Moshe Gershuni, right? But it is intended to be a crucifixion. And then, of course, the idea of sacrifice in Israeli society, so that Moshe Kadishman often uses the image of a goat, the sacrificial animal, which evokes the Agnus Dei, when John the Baptist sees Jesus, for the first time, he says in the Latin Gospel, Ecce agnus Dei, qui tollit peccata mundi, which means, look, behold, the Lamb of God, who, like the Lamb of the sacrifices in the temple, takes away the sins, but now the sins of the entire world. So you have echoes in Kadishman's goats of the image of the Holy Face that we've been talking about, and images of the sacrificial animals in Christianity. Moti Mizrahi did a project in which he walked the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem in 1973, carrying a self-portrait photograph, evoking the idea of, and walking with a cane, evoking the idea of the healing that Jesus engaged with in his life. Right? Efrat Natan has 3 A-line T-shirts hanging on 3, sponja, what are they called? Mops, right? On a rooftop, right? She put this up on a roof, and it's intended, of course, very cleverly to evoke the crucifixion. Here, it's much more kind of humorous, right? So we go from very serious sacrificial evocations to something that's somewhat comic or Dadaist or perplexing, to something that's actually kind of funny. And then, more serious works like Micha Kushner's Aisha El Khord with, a Palestinian woman in Khan Yunis, refugee camp, evoking the Madonna. This often happens in Israeli art. Or The Last Supper is evoked as well. Udines, as I showed you, the series Soldiers evokes the Last Supper. And Ari Katz, right? And Eretz Israeli did a sort of kind of parody of the Pietà, or it's a perplexing work. It has to do with mothers and sons and martyrdom. And of course, just look at the news, right? AP Haaretz, an incident in Bidu in 2004, and trying to make parallels with the deposition or even with the Passion of Christ, right? Then we have alternatives and stand-ins for Jesus, most famously Udi Ness, playing with this imagery, right? A yarmulke Israeli soldier with his dog tags, in the desert, besotted with his own muscles. What are we supposed to understand him as? A celebration of Israeli military might, a condemnation of Israeli militarism, a comment on homoeroticism or narcissism, a consideration of race. This is, after all, a brown Jew. And you're all of those things. But what's true is that this is an anti-Jesus figure. Right? And so we come full circle. So back to the question of what's your favorite painting. One of my favorite paintings is this painting by Maritzi Gottlieb. And I've shown you before, Jews praying in the synagogue on Yom Kippur. Gottlieb was a painter Polish painter, who was very much interested in painting the so-called real life of Jews of his time, but also evoking other topoi. So this figure in the painting is the Jesus-like figure. And I'll talk about him in a second. I've talked about him before, but I just want to give you a little bit more Gottlieb. Right. So Gottlieb actually did paint images of Jesus preaching in the synagogue, and you can see, you can see parallels, right? And you can see parallels between those and Jesus, called Jesus among the doctors, Jesus as the interlocutor of a bunch of old scholarly figures in the Jerusalem temple, according to the Gospel of Luke, right? Another Maritzi Gottlieb, Christ before his judges, right? In fact, that painting was in the exhibition about the Jewish Jesus, and I just love this image of this Haredi guy, this ultra-Orthodox guy, looking at Jesus in the painting. But in this painting, what we have is that, it's an image of this central figure here, who's supposed to be Joseph betrayed by his brothers because of the coat of many colors, but also Jesus. And it's also a self-portrait of the artist who was spurned by his love and eventually went out in the rain, caught a cold, got sick and died right after painting this painting. And so the face that looks out at us is in effect, the face of Jesus in a different key. So I hope you enjoyed this exploration. And if you have any, uh, oof, where are we? Am I still here? Am I still here? Yes. Stop the share. Okay. If you have any questions, I'd be pleased to address them. Ari, will you moderate, please?
Yes, our group always has questions. We have a little bit of time. So first of all, people have asked for that first slide, which shows the three Last Suppers, particularly Noah and Dahlia Taft, who I sent the image to, would like me to send it to them for their wall.
Okay.
So send me that, please.
You sent it to me, so you
No,
may.
no, the three. You made it into the
Oh,
triptych.
I
They
see.
want the triptych.
They want the
Um,
trip.
so first of all, I would say that we've been CSP Adventures. We were in Israel in May. We did an art and culture trip, and then we were in Germany. And Jeff Kaufman points out that we saw in the museum. Oh gosh, we just did a program about it. We saw the Golgotha by Efrat
Oh,
Natab. Like it's in there, so we got to see it. But I don't think anybody pointed out that it was supposed to be a play on that, so we didn't know that.
I've
So that
just
was
sent
number one.
the image to everybody, by the way. Everybody has it now, including you.
Okay, thank you. And then number two, we were in Nuremberg, so we were in the hometown of Dürer.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's great that you showed us that his own art became the art of other people. And just, I mean, the questions that people have were like, well, who were in the original paintings of Jesus? Who was the model? I mean, we'd have probably have no idea, right? But
Right.
someone became famous forever because they were in that first
Well,
image of
what's
Jesus. Who was the
interesting is
model?
that the model was actually a literary text. So there's a Greek literary text that's very early. It's probably it might be from the third or fourth century, and it purports to be an eyewitness depiction of Jesus. So all the features that you are used to, the short beard and this and that, the way the eyes look, all of that is in this text. Now the text pretends it was written in the first century, but it was written probably in the third or maybe the fourth century Byzantine period. And it probably reflects existing artworks and is a way of validating those artworks and saying, look, this has our hechsher, this has our imprimatur, right? So it's a chicken and egg question. But there was, I think very early on, there was a sense of what Jesus looked like. In the earliest depictions of Jesus, he is unbearded and young and looks like a Roman emperor, because the theological point there is that he is the emperor of the universe. But as the Roman Empire declined and and was less important in the world, the image of Jesus progressively got more Jewy, actually. So he does, he does look like a Jew. It's only in the later Middle Ages that he stops being dark and pale and becomes blonde and pale. And
Well,
that's what,
that was the question. Was the early art, did he look more swarthy?
yeah, always, yes.
Um, so a little talk about the reclaiming of Jesus when we're in the Jewish Museum of Berlin, which is not run by Jews, but it's the Jewish Museum of Berlin. They have an area where you go out and they have famous Jews, the famous Jewish area, and it's like caricatures. And they include Jesus there. And then for my going away present, people bought me a scarf to give to Amy. I got a pen, and Amy got the scarf.
Mhm.
And Jesus is on that scarf. And I just
Nice,
feel so the question is like for my parents' generation, Jesus is you cannot, I mean, you're not putting that picture of Jesus up in your house. And none of the art you showed us by Jewish, I mean, Jeff Kaufman does not have Jesus in his house, is my guess.
right,
Maybe. Jeff is a little unusual. Maybe he does. But my parents would never do it. I don't think I would have it.
right.
But it kind of was strange for me that they included Jesus on that scarf and they included him in the art going out of the museum. But he is Jewish. There is, I like that you built into the different images like subversion of the Jesus story, the deviations, and but reclaiming is something I guess that's going on now. But
Yeah, more or
but it's still
less.
challenged. So A, I wanted to share that, and B is the question is, would your wife wear that scarf?
No, in fact, I want to show you something. Let me just do
My
this.
wife has to wear the scarf because she got it as a present from Jeff
See,
and Marion.
Jeff and Marion. So
Right.
I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a painting, which is one of my favorite paintings. I'm putting it in the chat. It's Simon Martini's Holy Family. And why it's one of my favorite paintings is because it's from the story of Jesus um, being found in the temple. He goes up to Jerusalem for Pesach with his parents. He gets lost, and they find him in the temple debating with the scholars. And of course, he outdoes them. And his parents say, "What happened? Why were you there? Why did you stray from us?" So this is that moment. And you have Mary sitting on the ground. She's like, "No, where were you?" And you have Joseph saying, "Look at your mother. You're going to kill your mother." And you have Jesus standing there with his arms crossed. Do you see it? It's the most Can everybody see it? I hope so. It's the most amazing picture of a bar mitzvah boy ever painted. And I, of course, have a reproduction of this because I love it so much, but Augie won't let me have it in the house. So it goes in the office. So that's the answer to your
Well,
question.
maybe CSP, like we have hundreds of people. Everyone should just reclaim Jesus today. Not as a prayer or
I see.
a deity, but as a
I see.
Jew and art.
I think it sounds a little suspect, but okay.
Well, okay. I have the scarf. I don't know what to tell you. The last question, I guess, is, and I believe we may have discussed in another context, but can you share why you think Chagall was so obsessed with Jesus? And was
Yeah.
any other Jewish artist like Chagall
Yeah, a
obsessed
lot
with
of
Jesus?
Jewish artists were obsessed with Jesus because they were secular and they wanted to be a part of the larger world, and Jesus was a part of that world. But they also wanted to show the goyim that that was our boy, you know. So it's that, but it's also the idea that you've come from your that you've come from Russia, Poland, Eastern Europe, and you've been through Kishinev, and now you're going through the run up to the Holocaust or the Shoah itself, et cetera, et cetera. And you want to answer the question of the interlocutor of Lamentations, who says, "Hayesh machov kemachovi," is there anyone who has suffered as much as I have suffered? Those words, which are in the voice of Jeremiah the prophet, speaking for the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple, are taken up by Christians and put in the mouth of Jesus. So Jesus, looking at us, suffering, is saying, has anyone suffered as I have suffered? And the answer of Chagall and these other Jewish artists is yes, as a matter of fact. You were one dude, right? We're talking about the suffering of a people, the suffering of untold millions of people, or told millions of people. And so it's almost a shtoch in the direction of Christianity's um, thinking about Jesus as being singularly a victim.
Hmm, thank you. Um, you showed us up to contemporary. Is Jesus a contemporary? I mean, are you seeing Jesus being painted by Jews today or Jewish artists in any different kind of context? Is that kind of a contemporary theme as well?
I think
Bigger
there's,
than just some of the stuff you showed us, or is it kind of
I think
just
there's
always there?
less. I think there's less explicit Jesus stuff in Jewish art today. What's going on with artists is very interesting because there's all kinds of artists, the Jewish artists now, right? So some come from religious backgrounds and do religious themes, right? Some of them come from secular backgrounds and do secular themes. Some of them come from secular backgrounds and want to reclaim religious themes because they want to evoke a Judaism without Zionism, for instance, right? Because they're so far on the left, right? And in all of those contexts, you occasionally will find a Jesus, and this is something that Sherelle might be able to address. I don't have that many examples, but for the most part, that phenomenon has not quite resurfaced yet. I think Adi Ness was the last one to do it. And I think that artists are especially mortified at the idea that they might be viewed as copying other artists. So Adi Ness is too fresh in our collective Jewish art memory at this moment. So we'll see what happens in the next decade.
Thank you. Those of you who came to Israel with us in 2014, you probably remember we met with Adi Ness and we saw this art for the first time. And it was so amazing. We brought Adi Ness to Orange County, California to do a program.
Nice,
And he's a
nice.
very nice person,
Yeah.
and very creative. And yeah, he was the inspiration for the last camping supper, CSP. Okay, what are we doing next week?
What are we doing next week? Next week, we are talking about Jewish spaces in Christian art, which is my new book. So I have to figure out how somehow to distill, what's going to probably be a 300-page book into an hour of talking. But I think I'm up to that task, and I look forward to sharing it with all of you. So
And you've written this book, you've outlined this book.
I have it in my head.
Hmm. And so CSP will be mentioned in the book, obviously, again, so that
Oh
people
yeah, I think I sent you the acknowledgments. Okay, no, not of that book, but of this
right.
book.
Oh, okay.
PSP is always mentioned.
Okay. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Terrific program as usual. Sorry, Nicole, we don't have a moment for a live communication. So if you have a question for us, please either email me or text me, and I will make sure to get it to Mark. And what else? What can I tell people? Go back to preparing for Hanukkah, shopping, maybe buy someone a piece of Jesus art and reclaim it
Good.
like a
All
scarf,
right.
like I got. Okay.
Peace. See you around.
Bye,
Bye bye.
everybody. everybody. Take care. Be good out there.